I am most happy and honored to introduce to you as our next speaker, JoAnn Farb. She is a former microbiologist with a global pharmaceutical company. Can I say which one? Go ahead. Okay, Merck Pharmaceuticals. Okay, boo. She is also she is a nutrition educator. She is the mother of 2 lifelong vegan daughters and the author of a book which I highly recommend, which I've read, and a wonderful book called Compassionate Souls, Raising the Next Generation to Change the World. JoAnn is working on her 3rd book, Gluten, the science that explains the popularity of paleo, low carb, and keto, which answers how those who already avoid gluten can best reduce their future risk of chronic disease. Now, I just want to give you a quick background how I got to know JoAnn several decades ago. JoAnn wrote me either 1 or 2 letters, and I believe they might have even been handwritten, in which she described her visit to a chick hatchery as an employee of Merck, and the horrific description of the chick hatchery, how the wheels of the carts taking the chicks from here to there would just run over the baby chicks and squash them, how the workers had like 10 cigarettes in their mouths while they were doing whatever they were doing to the chicks.
You're giving away part of my talk.
Okay, I'll stop then. Okay, sorry. But this is a good introduction. But then she wrote a letter about her visit to an expo that I have been to many times in Atlanta, Georgia, the International Poultry Expo. And her description there, are you going to talk about that too?
That one I'm not, no.
Okay.
Go right ahead.
So I'll just tell you in a word what she said was, in this letter that she wrote to me, JoAnn said, you know, I walked around this place and there are like acres and acres and acres of basically chicken and turkey torture apparatuses. And she said, and it didn't seem to bother anybody. She said, I seemed to be the only one there who was appalled and horrified and felt like I was in a Holocaust situation, and nobody else seemed to see it as an issue. So I subsequently put both of her rather lengthy but totally detailed passages in my own book, Prison Chickens, Poisoned Eggs, An Inside Look at the Modern Poultry Industry, because she wrote so vividly and evocatively about the Poultry Expo in Atlanta, which still goes on every January, and about her visit to the chick hatchery. So, and we've been friends and colleagues ever since, and JoAnn lives in Lawrence, Kansas, and she's a great activist and a great person all around, and I'm delighted to introduce her to you now. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Karen. Thanks. Thank you. So, okay, so first I just want to say thank you to Karen. She has inspired me so much all these years. So, good morning. I want to talk with you today about something that I think may be really important to the success of our movement. Have you ever heard somebody say, or maybe you've thought this yourself, say something like this statement up here? I was at a vegan event when I heard a vegan on stage say to the audience, the hardest thing about being vegan are the pushy vegans who offend others. I'm not that kind of vegan. And so I want to explore with you a little more fully what is being expressed in this sentiment. So to give context to what I'm going to share with you, I first need to tell you a little bit about myself. I was a lonely child, overweight at a time when most kids were thin. I didn't know how to dress, I didn't know the status symbols, and I just didn't fit in. And so I really turned to animals for companionship. And when I was about 9 years old, I found a dove on the ground with a bullet hole in her wing. And I took her home, And I cared for her for several months until she was able to fly away again. And after that, the neighborhood found out about it. And so I kind of got this reputation in the neighborhood as the person to go knock on their door when you found injured or orphaned wildlife. And so out of all that, I really thought of myself as an animal lover. And then I went to high school. And the high school that I went to had a nationally recognized program that trained students like myself to teach science workshops to groups of grade school children that were bussed over. And for the first time in my life, I actually felt like I fit somewhere and I belonged. And I loved my science teachers. They were my mentors. And so even though it disturbed me, I followed their example and taught hundreds of students how to do frog dissections. And I participated in the feeding of mice and rats and rabbits alive to snakes. And so then I got to college, and I was really excited when I was selected above all of my peers to work in an animal lab that paid better than almost any other student job. And it was an easy jump for me from feeding rats to snakes to experimenting on them, especially because at that time I believed that lab animal research had a net positive benefit on humanity. But I was doing like these terrible things to rats until I realized that our experimental design was so flawed that even if we collected data, it would be meaningless. And when I realized this, I went right into the head of my lab, my professor, and I explained the situation to him. And you know what he said to me? He said, "Yeah, I know." He said, "But you're getting some good education here." And he said, "And I've got this grant money, and if I don't use it up, I'll get less next time. So just keep doing what you're doing." So later, I was in grad school, and when I was offered a position with the pharmaceutical company Merck, global pharmaceutical company, the job that I had with them was unique because it had me reporting to both the marketing side and the scientific side. And because of that, I was actually able to see a bigger picture of what was going on and connect some things that normally only people far more invested in the company's success would ever be able to connect. And as a result of what I saw there, I learned a lot of things that I would probably never have learned otherwise. And as part of that job, I actually toured hundreds of industrial operations that were using animals both to produce food and in research. But one of the things that was really interesting to me that I saw there was, and I was in lots and lots of different facilities doing lab animal research. One of the things I discovered was that very, very few of them, what they were doing, even had a pretense about saving human lives. And yet every single one of them had these big posters up on the wall that would say, "Lab animal research saves lives." And I realized why they were up there, because those posters were actually very important to the morale of the people who were working in these facilities. And I don't think any of them ever really even thought about the fact that they could see that what we were doing didn't even have any relevance, but that was important to them. Now, except for having to tour animal facilities and see the bad things happening to animals, which was not something I did all the time, I actually loved my job. I loved the people I worked with, the pay, the benefits, the travel, the status. All of that part was really great. But because I came face to face with something, and that was that my personal food choices were a big driver of a lot of the research I was seeing and the animal food production, I realized that the only way I could go forward at that point in life was to become a vegan. Now, this was at a time when I had never met a vegan in real life. And I was in Kansas, too. Did I mention that? I was in Kansas. And so because everything pretty much I knew about the animal rights movement at that point, I had learned from within the animal-using community. And I knew the narrative was that anybody who supported animal rights was a terrorist. I knew I better be a closet vegan. And so it was just like this private thing I did. As I said, I didn't know any other vegans in real life. But I didn't want to lose my job, so I was very careful to not let anybody know what I really thought. Now, of all the terrible places that I toured, there was one in particular that stood out in my mind and that lodged itself in my memory more deeply than anything else. And it was a commercial chicken hatchery. And in case you're not aware, this is where almost every chicken in America comes from, including those that you may see people raising in their backyards for eggs. They almost all come from these commercial hatcheries as well. And I think the reason the hatchery stood out in my mind was because there was something I saw there for myself that I'll explain to you here in a moment that reminded me of something I had learned as a child that I had never been able to understand. But let me tell you first about the hatchery and what I did see there. So the hatchery is filled with these walk-in incubator rooms like you see on the left here. And they're set so that on any given day, all of the eggs on these trays, on these carts, in these rooms will hatch more or less on that day. And when that happens, the carts are wheeled down the hall to a station where there's 3 men, and it's their job to pick off the live chicks and put them onto a conveyor belt that takes them to this other station of 5 women, and they give the chicks their first round of vaccinations. And as I was watching the men do their job, because their part of the job was a lot easier than what the women were doing, they could work very quickly, and the conveyor belt would get backed up, and they would just have to stop and take these breaks. And so when they were stopped, they'd be smoking their cigarettes, or they'd be standing around telling jokes. And I was kind of watching from a distance when I saw one really active chick hop up to the edge of a tray and then hop over the edge and fall to the floor. And I couldn't quite see the floor from where I was at that moment, and I wondered why nobody bent down and picked the chick up. Where did the chick go? You know, a baby chick falling 4 or 5 feet probably is not hurt when they land on the ground. A little while later, I was where I could kind of see the floor, and so I looked down, and that's when I noticed there were dozens of chicks. And many of them were fine and unhurt and just running around on the floor there. But then I watched the next round of carts come through. And as they did, some of the chicks got caught under their wheels and smashed. And the floor, this will be the only picture like this, okay? I promise. And so the floor was actually littered also with half-smashed chicks stuck by their own blood and guts to the floor. And the thing I was thinking when I saw this was 2 things. One, why didn't these men with nothing else to do at least pick the chicks up before this happened to them? And 2, once it did happen and they're standing there with nothing to do and these chicks are still alive and flapping crazily but they can't move, why don't they at least step on them and put them out of their misery? Like, why would you just stand there and let that happen? And it was that in particular that made me think of something I had learned as a child that I had also never been able to understand. And that was when I learned about the Holocaust. And of all the terrible things I learned about the Holocaust, one in particular really lodged in my brain. And it was the fact that, I forgot to tell you about the people in the hatchery. I should have thrown this in first. So I actually got to know some of these workers outside of the hatchery, and they weren't monsters. They were actually just normal people like everybody else I knew. They were husbands, they were fathers, they were, some of them, people of faith who went to church. And so that's what really got me. I knew these people. They weren't just the caricature that you would think of people who would behave the way that they did. And when I was learning about the Holocaust, and I learned that many of the Nazi guards who did some of the most horrific things to children would go home at the end of each day, and they were normal husbands and fathers. And so as a child learning about that stuck with me because I had, up to that point in my life, this naive idea that there were good people and there were bad people, and that there were distinctions between them. And what I learned about the Holocaust and then what I saw here really challenged that notion. So I really found myself asking both times, in both situations, how could so many seemingly average people have failed to realize the harm that they were causing? And so following the Holocaust, there were actually many academics and scientists. There were many academics and scientists who were asking the same question too. And perhaps the best known of them was a Yale professor named Stanley Milgram. And if you've ever taken a beginning psychology class, they almost always talk about his research in there. But the thing to know about it is that from the research that he did, he found that given the right circumstances, about 2/3 of us will go along with things that we know cause harm to others. And Stanley Milgram himself said, ordinary people simply doing their jobs and without any particular hostility on their part can become agents in a terrible destructive process. Now, I'm not on Facebook, but somebody who is found this on a private Facebook post, and I thought it really makes this point well, too, so I wanted to share it with you. And it's this: that which has soothed the conscience of every slave master, of every Nazi soldier, of every perpetrator of systemic injustice, is something which exists within all of us. To presume that those who perpetrate these atrocities are in some way fundamentally distinct from the rest of us, to otherize them as evil in contrast with our own presumed virtue, is to doom humanity to an endless repetitive cycle of their mistakes. In other words, we are all more vulnerable to going along with things that harm others or contribute to systemic injustices than we realize. And certainly I can see this in my own history, doing the research, teaching dissections on frogs and working in the rat lab. And so the question we must each keep asking ourselves, and the point I most want to make in the rest of the material I'm going to show you now, is this: how do we catch ourselves when we are faced with situations like this so that we are not the people that future generations look back on and say, how could they have not seen what they were contributing to? So let's talk about Howard Lyman's slide, because he's one of my heroes too. So I hadn't been vegan very long. I was at that job. It lasted at my job actually about 3 years, and then I knew it was time to quit. And I had recently gotten married, and my husband and I wanted to start a family. And so we thought, well, I'll quit my job, we'll have a couple children, I'll go back to work. I was expecting to return to this industry because that was like all I knew. And I just thought, I'll find a job in the industry where I don't actually have to see the bad things happening to animals. So that was my thinking at the time. I had just put in my 2 weeks' notice when I heard that this man, Howard Lyman, was coming to town to speak. This was 1993. And Howard Lyman is a fourth-generation cattle rancher, feedlot operator who turned vegan and then dedicated his life to raising awareness about why veganism is so important. And this was one of his earlier tours of the United States, and he was coming through our area. And I wanted to go hear him talk so much, but I was terrified because I was afraid that if the wrong people found out I went to go hear Howard Lyman talk, I'd never be able to work in my field again. But I went anyway. And that night, for the first time in my life, I met another vegan in real life. And so a few years after that was when Howard Lyman appeared on the Oprah Winfrey Show. And many of you, if you know this history, you know about this. And he was on the Oprah show telling the American people the truth about how we were grinding up cows and feeding them back to cows. And the next day, the cattle futures plummeted as a result of that show. And a group of wealthy Texas cattle ranchers filed a $20 million lawsuit against Howard and Oprah that took like 6 years to completely settle. And it was a really big deal. But that led to my getting to know Howard Lyman. And as it turned out, I did not return to the pharmaceutical industry after I had my children. Instead, I founded the first vegan society in the Kansas City area and began arranging speaking tours for various people who were coming through the area, Howard being one of them, and doing publicity for them. And when he was arranging his next tour, I actually got in touch with our local natural foods co-op. And this was a co-op that was started by vegetarians and was at that point still almost entirely a vegetarian store. And they were thrilled to partner with me. They rented a venue, they paid for a lot of publicity, and Howard came in and gave his talk. It was very, very well received. And within a couple years of that, that Natural Foods Co-op invited me to start teaching nutrition education and vegan cooking classes with them. And it was a great program. And for over 5 years, I was a regular presenter in their program. I was getting excellent evaluations. My classes were growing to the point that I had waiting lists for many of them. And then something changed. The co-op actually made a strategic change. They began partnering with local producers of meat, dairy, and eggs. And I started to see a lot more things change. Their messaging began to change. For instance, when I looked at their advertising, this is one of their circulars, and I asked the question, what would happen if somebody spent their money equally amongst the most prominently advertised foods? What would that look like for their diet? And when I did the analysis, it meant that you would be getting 10% of your calories from plants and 90% from animals. And I watched year after year as more and more shelf space was dedicated to meat, dairy, and eggs. And it was growing larger and larger. But that wasn't all that was happening. I began to get censored in what I could say in my classes. Now keep in mind, this was not a corporate-owned store. This was not a private business that somebody owned. This was a community-owned food co-op organized around democratic values, of which I was a member owner of this organization, and I was being told I could not say certain things. And so it was just like I always do. I was submitting my class descriptions, and I decided one time to do a class that I was going to title Forks Over Knives. You're all familiar with that wonderful documentary? Yeah. And so I wanted to let people know I would be teaching a class based on that documentary, showing them how to prepare foods consistent with the ideas being put forth in that documentary. So I titled it Forks Over Knives, and my description of that class began, according to a growing cadre of doctors, when it comes to cancer, heart disease, and diabetes, our dinner fork is more powerful than the surgical knife. And I submitted it thinking, and I was already self-censoring myself a lot at that point because of the feedback I was getting from them. So I submitted this and thought, I haven't said any of the things they've told me I can't say. And instead of printing it, management communicated this to me, and they said, that statement about the dinner fork being more powerful than the surgical knife is strong, but it could seem inflammatory to some people. I would also ask that statement about the surgical knife not be made in class. Now, there's a bigger picture, though, of what was going on at that time, and I think we really need to frame this in that context. You see, when I first became vegan in the 1990s, veganism was not seen as a threat to animal agriculture. It was not seen as a threat to people's coveted family traditions or their habits. And so my veganism was just like a curiosity to most people. The media loved me. They were doing all kinds of articles on my organization, on the programs I was arranging, on my veganism specifically, and always framing it in a positive light. I got invited repeatedly to be on local morning news TV shows, talking about veganism, and it was all going so well. I just couldn't imagine that it would ever not be that way. But today, everybody in America knows there are millions of vegans. Vegans are starting and running successful vegan businesses. Elite athletes are becoming vegan and setting new records. And vegan parents are birthing and raising healthy vegan children. So now when one of us says, I am vegan, it actually feels to people like they are being attacked because it reminds them that they are not living consistent with some of their very own values, such as it is wrong to unnecessarily hurt animals, and it's wrong to ruin the environment for our neighbors and future generations. And increasingly, there is more and more evidence that animal agriculture is a driver of almost every category of environmental destruction. People know this. And that's why I think this meme from Vegan Street is so terrific. Yeah? You all know Vegan Street? Yeah, okay. So let's take a look back in time now and ask, how has social justice unfolded among otherwise good people? And so to begin this, I just want to tell you what happened to me at the co-op. So first of all, by this time, I knew the management at the co-op. I knew most of the people on the board of the co-op. And they were good people. Like, many of them had long histories of being involved in all kinds of social justice work. They were environmentalists. They were doing all kinds of wonderful things. They cared deeply, smart people. And let's see. And so you need to know that about them first. Well, one day, my friend, and so my classes were going well. Everything was fine there, sort of. And one day, my friend Judy Carmen, sitting right over there, says to me, the Kaw Valley Farm Tour is coming up. This is the local farm tour where they open up the farms for everybody to see. She goes, we really ought to go on that and just document, what's happening with the local, organic, humane, grass-fed meat and dairy and eggs. So I go on this with her, and I can't help myself. As a result, I write this blog post called The Happy Local Meat and Dairy of Kaw Valley. My personal blog, I put it up there. And it was a couple months later when local farmers on the Kaw Valley Farm Tour saw my blog, and they went right into the management of the co-op, and they said to them, why are you letting this woman teach here if these are her values? And I lost my job. But the most important thing for you to take away from this is this. How could so many otherwise good people who were social justice advocates not see that they were acting in opposition to values they already held about free speech, democratic values, nonviolence, and environmental sustainability? How could that happen? And in thinking about that, it connected me back with all those other instances that I've talked about of otherwise good people facilitating things that are absolutely contrary to what they claim to really care about. It's not just that the harms come from good people doing bad things. They also come from good people simply being quiet and not speaking up. And I thought this from the founder of Change.org was really a good expression of this. He says, one of my younger brothers unexpectedly came out as gay, and then he said, the thing that was most hurtful to him wasn't watching people who were anti-gay attack him, but the good people who stood by and did nothing, people like me. But there is actually a much bigger cautionary tale here. How many of you have heard of the Buck versus Bell case? So this was a Supreme Court case in 1928. And the Chief Justice of the court that time was Oliver Wendell Holmes. He's often remembered as a big social justice proponent and one of the most progressive justices we've ever had. And he wrote the 7-1 majority decision in this case that legalized the forced sterilization of a young woman named Carrie Buck, who had actually become pregnant when her foster family's natural-born nephew raped her. And they were so embarrassed by what happened, they turned her back over to the state. And the state looked at her long family history that hadn't been so good. And this was when eugenics was starting to get more popular around the world. Oliver Wendell Holmes got caught up in that. And he actually wrote a decision that was not only harmful to Carrie Buck and others in this country, but what people don't realize is how much harm his decision facilitated around the world just because he had done that. And in fact, he said in his ruling, he said, it is better for all the world if society can prevent those who are manifestly unfit from continuing their kind. 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. And at the Nuremberg trials following the Holocaust, many Nazis actually quoted from Holmes' decision in their defense. In fact, many historians have pointed to Holmes' decision as one of the things that contributed to Hitler's success in getting others to support his final solution. Hitler himself even said, "I have studied with great interest the laws of several American states concerning prevention of reproduction by people whose progeny would in all probability be of no value or be injurious to the racial stock." Now, there are many examples of progressive people, activists even, like us, working to change society for the better, who have failed to see how they were themselves perpetuating injustices. You know, at the Anti-Slavery Convention, Lucretia Mott, you all know who she is? She's one of my heroes. She was pretty cool. And she was working on both abolition and women's suffrage in the 1700s. And she was selected to be one of the delegates from America to go over to England at the World Anti-Slavery Convention. And this would have been a really big deal. She was an older woman traveling by boat. It would have been a long, difficult journey. She gets there, and other abolitionists, social justice advocates, won't allow her to sit with the main delegates or to speak or participate at the convention because she's a woman. In a way, it's not surprising that they acted like this, because those benefiting from the status quo are always in a better position to make their perspective well known in society. And they always flood citizens with messaging like this that people get caught up in and they become involved in and support without being able to really step back and see the bigger picture of how they are perpetuating the oppressive paradigm. Maybe not in the specific area they're working on, but in other ways or in other areas. And so, you know, they were so successful at this with women's suffrage that even members of the oppressed class, housewives, were saying things like, you know, they didn't support women having the right to vote because if they voted differently from their husbands, domestic unrest would surely follow. Those opposing change have long sought to portray activists as pushy or aggressive. And this is a popular tactic because most people can be persuaded to object to what the activists are doing if you suggest to them, you know, you're being forced into something here. And it can that kind of gets people caught up in supporting an oppressive paradigm because nobody wants to feel like, you know, they're being forced, right? And so in the midst of social justice pressure to fit in and not rock the boat, we can all get caught in the oppressor's Orwellian perspective. So as you look at this image, ask yourself, who really had the power, right? You know, notice especially how women who had less power are depicted as forcing their values, right? No wonder so many people at the time failed to see this injustice for what it is. And keep in mind, we are looking back now with the benefit of a whole lot of history and a whole different culture. So this isn't so hard for us to see now. But I guarantee you similar things are operating right in front of us right now that we easily are missing. And so one of the things that's really good to do is to step back when you're getting hit with this kind of stuff and ask yourself, who is really forcing their values? And we bring this to the modern-day animal rights movement, and you think about the fact animal rights activists are often portrayed as forcing their values, right? And so is it really forcing your values to be educating other people and raising uncomfortable questions? Is that forcing? Or is it the people who are literally forcing violence on other animals that are forcing their values? So as I was thinking about all of this, and I was starting to see a bigger picture, one day I had an epiphany when I was thinking back to my own childhood experience at my grade school. And as I told you, I was a very left-out child. What I found out years later when I reconnected with some people I had known from that time I hadn't seen in many years was that we were the luck of the draw. Our class level at our grade school that year just had like way more bullies than almost anybody else. And the experience that I was having in there, like lots of people were also having that experience, and I had no idea. I really thought there was just a small handful of us who sat at the bottom of the hierarchy who were feeling this tremendous oppression there. And so it was in thinking about all of this that I started to be able to see a bigger picture that I think is so important for us. You know, and as I was looking back, I thought, well, why didn't I just reach out to a handful of other kids that really sat at the bottom, just like myself? Why didn't we, become partners or help each other in some way, right? Because this was all made visible when you had to pick partners or teammates, and we were the untouchables, like nobody would have anything to do with us. And so when I was thinking about that, the question was, well, why wouldn't we, whoops, I hope I didn't just mess something up. Why wouldn't we have banded together in some way or supported each other in some way? And you might think those lower down in the hierarchy experiencing injustice would be less likely to do the very same thing to others. But in fact, the opposite actually happened. The more oppressed one of us felt, the more we distanced ourselves from anyone else who also had low status. And I think it was because we feared even more oppression if we were associated with any of the other victims. Time and time again, those concerned with their own inclusion contribute to the victimization of others. And we instinctively distance ourselves from those the dominant group find most problematic. Supporting the oppressor's perspective, even in a tiny way, can ease the pressure on us by aligning us, at least in part, with those who hold the power. And we see this when we look at India's caste system, and you can probably think of a million more examples as you just start looking around. You will see evidence of this happening. And in fact, Susan B. Anthony, I think, was expressing this sentiment when she said, "Let the question of the woman be brought up first, and that of the Negro last." And it's interesting because here was Susan B. Anthony, who claimed to be supporting women and justice for women, and yet she was omitting that group of women that probably experienced the most severe oppression, women of color. Now, my point in showing you all this is to make visible something that is often not considered and not looked at. That our instinctive desire to fit in by not rocking the boat has worked against social justice progress so many times. And I think Martin Luther King's writings actually exemplify this as well when he said, "I have been gravely disappointed with the white moderate who is more devoted to order than to justice. And I was rather disappointed that fellow clergymen would see my nonviolent efforts as those of an extremist." So I want to do a little thought experiment with you now. Imagine that you were at a vegan event, maybe this one today, and somebody here speaking in front of you got up in front of the room, somebody you respected and you liked what they were saying, and they said to you something like this: "The hardest thing about being vegan are the pushy vegans who offend others. I'm not that kind of vegan." And now imagine that this evening you go to some social event, maybe you're even the only vegan there, maybe it's mostly non-vegans, and an opportunity presents itself for you to respectfully speak up on an issue about justice for animals. Wouldn't you be less likely to say anything if you had just come from a vegan event where this statement was made? So is it being labeled pushy that shames us into silence? Or is it that we see push being equivalent to force, being equivalent to aggression, which we reject? So think about what really is more forceful. And I'm not sure if you can all see this clearly. This is from Vegan's Sidekick. It's one of his memes. And basically on one side here you've got all these examples of violence against animals, and you've got dead animal bodies weighing down the scale there. And on the other, and so, which is actually more forceful, measuring force? Is it what's happening to animals? Or is it posting an image on your Facebook to try and get people to think about animal rights? Which is really more force? Vegans do not force their way of life on you. If you're not vegan, you are forcing your way of life, literally, on animals. So ask yourself, do you think it was or is wrong to push values about slavery and voting and marriage equality, drunk driving, protecting the environment? What would our world be like if those of us who can see the injustice of these things cared more about not offending anybody? What would our world be like? Can you think of a single example of social justice progress that was not the result of someone pushing their values? What would our world be like without people willing to speak unapologetically for justice? And so, if you remember only one thing from my whole talk, this is what I want you to remember. I'd like you to either write down this question or take a picture of it, because this afternoon you are going to hear people up here discussing the subject of clean meat. And you're going to hear a variety of perspectives on this. And so what I want you to do is to just think about, as the different perspectives are being shared, which of those are most consistent with helping to keep us from reinforcing the perspective of the oppressors and the oppressive paradigm that we are all caught in. And so the question to remember is, how do we keep from reinforcing the perspective of the oppressors? And you know, when I worked in the corporate world, I was well schooled in how to use the art of reductionism to focus people's attention on one piece of something, one piece of an issue that was maybe easiest to quantify, easiest to sell an idea or get them to do something based on that, which may actually have been counter to a bigger picture if you looked more holistically at whatever it was. And I think this is what we see in justice movements a lot too, is how the tendency is to try and focus people on some piece that can actually segue them to support something that's actually contrary to a more holistic view. And so I will close with this quote from Donald Watson. And for those who may not know, Donald Watson and a small group of others in 1944 actually are the ones who coined the word vegan and started the first vegan society with the intent of launching a peaceful revolution. And I love this quote by Donald Watson where he says, "We can see quite plainly that our present civilizations were built on the exploitation of slaves, and we believe that in time we will view with abhorrence the idea that humans once fed on the products of animals' bodies. A common criticism is that the time is not yet ripe for our reform. Can time ever be ripe for any reform unless it is ripened by human determination?" And I'll close with that. Thank you.